Here's just a brief overview of the application architecture that we're working with here in multi-tier web application development. It's been a little while since we've talked about this, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of a reminder of kind of the overall structure as we start pushing into the application server part of the application. Okay, this diagram shows here on the right-hand side the server stack of technologies, and on the left-hand side the browser stack. So as we've been talking about for the semester, we have at the bottom of the server stack the Postgresql relational database. And that's a relational database management system is how we refer to it. Postgres is where all of our data storage gets done persistently. And we have talked about how we want to avoid having to write code that's specific to a particular database. So on top of Postgres, we stack another layer called connects, and we've referred to this as a query builder. It knows how to convert JavaScript function calls into really generic database access code that abstracts away the specifics of the dialect of SQL in the database that we're using. That still exposes a kind of a tabular interface to the data. So on top of that, we have already added this layer called objection, which we discussed as being an object relational mapping layer. Objection provides us with a nice JavaScript interface that exposes the contents of the database and the results of the queries from the database as JavaScript objects that can have their own methods and so forth. What we're going to start talking about now is this next layer called the application server. So this is the code that's going to actually implement the Restful API that you've been learning about. It's another JavaScript library that layers on top of the rest of the application that's going to be able to retrieve information from the database and serve it out to the application as JSON objects. And it also knows how to respond to requests from the application in the browser in order to determine what information it needs to return to the browser. The network communication that we are going to see between the server and the client is this RESTful API. Again, that's something that just runs over an ordinary HTTP connection. So the difference being that instead of sending HTML or images or whatever back and forth between the server and the client, we're going to see information being passed mostly as JSON objects that are either going to contain requests or responses, depending on the kind of method that we're trying to execute in a particular request. That brings us over to the client side of the equation. I've kind of just made this really generic and just said browser, right? So this is whatever browser you use, and any modern browser has embedded within it a JavaScript engine. And then we're going to layer some additional software on top of that. We're going to use an application framework that's called Vue. That's one of kind of the top 3 application frameworks that are out there right now. And it's providing functionality that allows us to construct application objects and pages and screens and navigation and all the other things that we need to actually build a bona fide web app as the foundational functionality behind that. We're going to layer on top of that a user interface toolkit called Vuetify that, as you can tell from the name, is intended to work well with Vue. And Vuetify gives us all of the appropriate styling and buttons and widgets and other sorts of things that we'd want to be able to use in our actual application. Then finally, using Vuetify and Vue is going to be our web application, more JavaScript code that we'll be constructing that actually implements the functionality of the application that we're going to develop.